My name is Stuart Diamond, and I'm a Chief Advisor here at the Climate Change Commission, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Alongside me in the virtual room, we have Dr. Rod Carr, the Chair of the Commission, and Joe Hendy, our Chief Executive. We'll begin the webinar today with a presentation from Rod and Joe on the Emissions Reduction Monitoring Report. After the presentation, there will be an opportunity for you to ask us questions and for us to provide you with some answers. So if you have any questions, please send these in at any time during the webinar using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will try to get as many of those questions answered as we can in the time that we have available today. And finally, a note that this session is being recorded and will be made available on the Commission's website afterwards. And with those short introductory comments, I'd now like to hand over to Rod and to Joe for the presentation. Thank you, Rod and Joe.
Kia ora, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. I'm Rod Carr. I'm Chair of the Climate Change Commission. I'm going to say some brief introductory remarks and then allow Joe to lead the presentation. So the first thing I would like to point out is that the Emissions Reduction Monitoring Report that we released recently provides for the government of the day and all New Zealanders an assessment of the current state and expected progress towards achieving our emissions budgets, which are aligned with our emissions targets. That the conclusion so far is that we need to pick up the pace and reduce the risk in our pathway to achieve our 2030 budgets and beyond. The Commission's work highlights the uncertainty about the measurement of where we are, as well as the anticipation of what policies already in place, let alone policies that might be required, can achieve in the future. The focus of the report is about where we are. The focus of the report is not about whether a past or present government has done the right thing, and neither is this report an assessment of the government's draft emissions reduction plan for the 2026 to 2030 period. Rather, this report is a timely input into the government's work to establish and publish by the end of this year an emissions reduction plan consistent with achieving already regulated budgets. The conclusion that some good progress has been made is an early assessment of the first emissions budget period, which runs from 2022 to 2025. Parliament required us to use robust data as reported in the National Inventory to anchor our assessment of progress. The most recent National Inventory data published last year was for the year ending December 2022. We have updated on the basis of recent and available information, data and policies as at the 1st of April this year. To talk you through exactly what our conclusions are, I'll now pass over to Joe.
Thanks, Rod, and kia ora koutou. So first, I'm just going to outline a bit about why we do this job and also how we've gone about it, and then I'll go into the details of our conclusions. So the Commission is an independent agency, and one of our key roles is to monitor the country's progress in terms of our emissions reductions as well as our adaptation goals. And this particular report is looking at our emissions reduction progress. The reason that this has been given to an independent agency is so that there is independent, impartial scrutiny of how the country is tracking. And this gives assurance to the public and transparency around how we're tracking, as well as providing really useful input into the government's processes so that they can adjust their plans as needed. In doing this work, we look at the progress that has been made, the challenges that we've faced in the past years, and also really seek to highlight both the risks that we face to meet our targets into the future, as well as the opportunities that we have to get on track and even and progress. So moving to the next slide. This is the absolute first time we have done this work, and this work has been done in New Zealand. And so we've spent a long time developing our approach and methodology. And we've based it on well-regarded monitoring systems internationally and looking also at home. We've spent a lot of time working with a network of climate commissions around the world, and our approach is very closely aligned with what the UK Climate Change Committee has produced, of course adapted to suit the New Zealand system. The methodology has been reviewed by independent experts, and the results that I'm going to talk to you about today have come from the research, evidence and analysis conducted by the staff of the Commission and the board. As Rod was talking about, a range of data is updated at different times through every year, and we use the government official government statistics, the national inventory, government projections and provisional estimates of gross emissions in 2023. And we are aware that year on year data will change and things may shift around. So the concept here is that every year the Commission will produce a snapshot of where we're at, which will build a reliable picture over time. We've also assessed the policy that is in place to support the transition, and because this is a part of our monitoring role. And we have included policy scorecards within our report. We assess the policies based on 4 angles. 1, are the main policies in place? 2, is there sufficient funding and financing in place? 3, are the barriers being addressed and are there sufficient enablers? And 4 is about timeliness. Are we acting fast enough? And through each of these, we assess the risk of whether there's no risk, moderate risk, significant risk, or insufficient policy. Moving to the next slide. So what we have found overall is that emissions have dropped. So since 2019, gross emissions fell every year, and in 2022, they fell 4.2%. 75% of that was from energy and industry. Now, most of the fall from 2022 was related to factors that were beyond the government's control. But there is some very good signs that New Zealanders are acting, and that action is now being translated into reductions in emissions. And this includes the building of new renewable generation, solar, wind, the conversion of boilers from fossil fuels to solar and biomass, choosing to drive more electric and hybrid vehicles, and planting more forests. We can move to the next slide, please. Now, when we look at how we're tracking for EB1, what we've found is that our central estimate shows that we're on track for meeting emissions budget 1. But this is uncertain. We could miss the emissions budget 1 if one of a few factors occur that are outside the government's control. One is around the loss of forests. So if there's a significant difference in the amount of deforestation than is expected, then that could tip us into not meeting emissions budget 1. Another risk could be related to if we have a dry year, which affects our hydro generation, which would lead to the need to burn more fossil fuel in our electricity system. And the third relates to transport emissions. If we experience rising transport emissions, then that could tip us into not meeting emissions budget 1. And so we've had some early indications that although recently transport emissions have been trending down, there has been it looks like in the data these may be on the rise again. Moving to the next slide. When we look at emissions budgets 2 and 3, and also looking out to the 2030 methane target, we find significant risks. The greatest risks relate to agriculture and transport. In agriculture, we highlight the risk around the absence of the main policy tools needed to support changing to lower emissions practices and uses. In transport, we assess that the current policy tools are not enough to drive the level of transport emissions reductions that are needed. And a key point here is that if we don't hit our targets in agriculture and transport, for emissions budget 2, we're not going to be able to rely on forestry to make up the difference. And this is simply a timing thing. Trees planted now are not going to store a sufficient amount of carbon to offset any overshoot in agriculture and transport. It's too short a time frame. And there's also issues in terms of the emissions trading scheme that we highlight. In the short term, it is not responsive enough to be able to guarantee the quantities of emissions budgets we need. And this relates to the surplus of units that is currently estimated to be held within the country. Moving on to the next slide. The good news is, well, that there are opportunities to go faster and further. And there is an urgent need to actually strengthen policies and strategies so that we do meet our goals. We've got opportunities to go faster on electric vehicles, to do more in industry, and there's a significant opportunity to in geothermal as well. And these are opportunities that take us beyond what we thought was possible when we did our first assessment back in 2021. And there are policies that can help and support acceleration in these areas. We've also highlighted areas for attention in each sector. When we look at energy and industry sector, we highlight the barriers to converting to electricity and biomass, and particularly relating to the capital cost and access to low-cost financing for many of the things that you might do in energy and industry. There's also issues around the cost of connection to the electricity lines that you need if you are going to do a big electrification project, such as electrifying a boiler. And we need to make sure that we have enough renewable energy generation and storage to provide a reliable electricity supply, so that when people need to use it, when business needs to rely on it, and it will be increasingly relying on the electricity, we know it's going to be there. In transport, we highlight issues around the affordability of EVs, and this is related to the sticker price and and the relative to the fossil fuel alternatives. And we also highlight the need for infrastructure around walking, cycling, and public transport. In agriculture, we highlight opportunities to support producers through extension and advisory services. And these are going to be particularly important to help deploy new approaches and new technologies as they come to market. And there needs to be additional work to enable the commercialisation of technologies. So making sure we have the right regulations in place to ensure that they meet, for example, food safety qualities, and we're doing the sufficient research and development. In relation to our forests and the benefit that they can provide us, there are risks, as I talked about earlier, around deforestation. And there's also opportunity to go further in terms of our native afforestation by providing incentives for increasing that. When we look at our waste sector, we can help shore up achieving our methane 2030 target through improved landfill gas capture. And looking at our gases, so these are the gases in refrigerants, there are opportunities around providing training for handling of these gases and putting in place product stewardship. More broadly, across the whole economy, opportunities to help the private sector and people to transition relate to supporting growing the capacity and skill sets in our workforce that we need for the climate transition, strengthening supply chains, and closing the gap in funding and finance. So that's a brief snapshot of what is a very comprehensive report. I'm now going to hand back to Stuart, and he's going to facilitate the Q&A for the next 40 minutes, so you can dive into the areas that you're particularly interested in. So back to you, Stuart.
Kia ora. Thanks very much, Jo, and Rod, to you also for your introductory comments. So this is the part of the webinar when we're in your hands as participants. We have Rod and Jo both with us here to answer questions. We have a wonderful team supporting us who are collecting all the questions that are coming through, and we'll try and get through as many of those as we can in the time available. While people are thinking about or formulating their questions for today, I might just begin perhaps with a simple one for you, Rod, which is we've just, as the Climate Change Commission, put out a first emissions reduction monitoring report. How does that relate to the government's emissions reduction plan, and at the moment the draft that's out for consultation?
So our report is an assessment of progress. So it's an input into the government's draft emissions reduction plan. The government can use our data and expert analysis to inform itself better about increasing the degree of certainty that they will indeed achieve the emissions budget for the 2026-2030 period, which the Prime Minister has committed among his 9 goals to achieving. So the commitment by the government is clear and well articulated. The plan to get there is under development. And the Commission's advice is that you need to de-risk the pathway to achieve that budget because of the degrees of uncertainty that are beyond the government's control. And that in order to have higher certainty, we need to take more and earlier action, particularly around transport and agricultural emissions.
Thanks very much, Rod. That's nice and clear and really helpful to have that clarification for people. We have a first question in from Jane, and I'm thinking perhaps, Jo, this might be one for you, which is when we're assessing the current emission reduction plan, the first emission reduction plan policies, and whether they will deliver. Is this the full range of ERP, the first emission reduction plan policies, or does it also account for those policies that are proposed to be removed from the emissions reduction plan? So I think that maybe the basis of that question is, what are we reporting against? Are we reporting against the first emissions reduction plan as it stood, or at what point do we make judgments or report against things that may have changed since then?
Stuart, so we've looked at what is in place as at the 1st of April 2024. So this includes what was put in place as part of the first emissions reduction plan, where there were actions and policies that were implemented, or had government agreements such as a cabinet or formal ministerial approval. And our policy scorecard assessment does not have included in it any formal actions, formal decisions by government past that date, or anything that was at a high level had been committed to, but not a formal cabinet agreement around the details of the policy. However, we do include in there some commentary around the scorecard where it's relevant, so that we're not completely missing the changing context.
Thanks very much, Jo. I know that's always a judgment, isn't it? At what point do you draw a line and provide a report against things that, as we know in life, do change through time? Thanks very much for that. We have a question in from Lucy. And I'm wondering who best to direct this one to. Let's see, it might be you, Jo, I think, again. In terms of the work that we've done, what do we think might be driving the recent increase in transport emissions in particular? So let's focus on the transport sector, please.
Yeah, so we have provisional estimates from emissions data from come in this year that suggest transport emissions might have increased by about 5% or 0.6 megatons from 2022. And this is a combination of increase in aviation and road vehicle emissions. Emissions have increased because the amount of travel has increased, and this is likely due to a combination of a bounce back in travel following the pandemic, and an increase in population, as well as lower fuel prices.
Thanks, Jo. Good to have that that clarification from you, and thanks very much for that question. A question from Leanne this time. Perhaps you, Jo, or Rod, feel free to chip in as well. How can businesses best contribute to and or tap into the opportunities that are available to reduce emissions? So we know the report speaks a little bit about opportunities. Can we talk a little bit about, please, and your insights into how businesses can best contribute to this this work and tap into those opportunities? Thanks.
Talk to that, Rod.
Yeah, so look, I'll start. The first thing is, I think every business has an obligation to know and understand its emissions profile. So what are the emissions to air from the combustion of fossil fuels and other sources of greenhouse gases from the business that you conduct? So that's a sort of necessary first, because if you don't measure, you can't manage, and if you're unaware of what's going on, then that's on you. Now, there's no reason not to know. Secondly, many businesses can leverage their supply chain by looking at the emissions of the inputs to their business that they need and asking their suppliers for the data on their emissions profiles, and working with suppliers to say, are there ways we can interact with our supply chain and the inputs we need for our business to reduce emissions somewhere outside our immediate scope of control? And then, of course, there's the channel to market. How do you get your products and services from where you've produced them into the hands of end consumers? And what choices do you have about what transport is used or how services are aggregated and delivered to your end customers? So those are immediate things that every and any business could choose to do. Businesses sometimes can also be advocates for their peer group, where they see a barrier to the uptake of new known technology. And some of those barriers are regulatory barriers. We would if we could, but we can't, so we don't. Some of them are therefore barriers that need to be addressed by politicians. Some of them are barriers in terms of access to capital. We would if we could, but we don't have the money to buy the low emitting way of doing our business. That can be a conversation with banks as to whether you can access green finance from within a bank. And in some cases, businesses can also, by supporting industry lobby groups, either make getting emissions lower easier or obfuscate and deny the need for emissions reduction. So there are many ways in which businesses are able to make a contribution. And finally, waste. Waste is an outright waste of resources. So understand what the waste products are from your business and do everything you can and sensibly should do to reduce waste, or to find somewhere where that waste can be used in an input to another process. So all of those are easy to do, top of the mind, ways in which businesses can be mindful about the environmental impact of what they do. Jo?
No, I think that's a good coverage, Rod.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rod. Really good, as we know, for any of these issues, if we can start to identify ways in which we can all take action, and in this case, a great question about how business can take action, and we have really known ways that people can act and where to look to. It really helps us to tackle this challenge. A question from Norbert, which I'm going to give to you, Jo, I think, which is about electric vehicles and energy, in fact. So electric vehicles have been mentioned as an option for emissions reduction, but not as an energy source. So isn't it the electricity sector, for example, geothermal, that can reduce emissions from gas or coal for electricity? And what does the role that electrical vehicles could play into that space?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. So our vehicles require energy to run. At the moment, the majority of our vehicles, the vast majority, run on fossil fuels, petrol, diesel, etc. And of course, by burning those fossil fuels, they're releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Now, the opportunity here is through electrifying those vehicles. So switching from burning fossil fuels to using electricity to run. And in that way, they avoid those tailpipe emissions. The critical thing, of course, is that additional energy needs to come from a renewable source. So the electricity that the electric vehicles are using, and the additional electrification load, we want that to be matched with additional renewable energy generation, such as solar or wind, but also there is a big opportunity in geothermal. And I mentioned earlier this opportunity to reduce emissions further from geothermal generation and through new technology that's available for re-injecting the geothermal emissions. So we have, throughout our work, talked about the need to not solely focus on electricity emissions and getting them down, but to actually look across the entire energy system and make sure that we're reducing emissions across that broader system.
Thanks very much, Jo. Anything, Rod, for you to add into that space?
Of course, there is the emerging technology, not yet widely or even commonly used in New Zealand, where you can store energy in your car battery and use that to supplement demand management, either at home level or even at the microgrid scale. So there are amazing new technologies emerging, which are not just about generating more electricity, but also how we store it in a way that can reduce peak demand. And that demand is demand that has to be met by pinch points in the lines companies and grids. So it is interesting that BlackRock, the global funds management company, has estimated that if the world is to decarbonize energy production and use along the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Pathways to 2050, we are going to need, as humanity, to invest $1 billion a day, every day, for the next 30 years in electricity generation, distribution, and the electric devices that will plug in. So if we can reduce the burden of investment required by more efficiently using what we have already produced, by knocking off the peaks and storing the electrons, then we will reduce the amount of capital required, we'll reduce the cost to households and businesses, and we'll accelerate the ability to make the transition because there'll be less pinch points in the supply chain for electrons.
Fabulous. Thanks very much for that addition, Rod. And those are staggering numbers, aren't they? $1 billion a day for 30 years. So yes, a big challenge ahead, but a lot of great work being done. Joe, we're having a great lot of questions coming in, and while we're just doing some sorting through of those questions, I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the relationship between some other parts of the climate architecture that we have in place. So another common question we get asked in the Commission is around emissions budgets and the extent to which, are they the same as the commitments that we make as a country, as Aotearoa New Zealand, under the Paris Agreement, and what's the relationship between those two?
Thanks, Stuart. So we've actually got a range of emissions goals. And so under the Paris Agreement, every country needs to set what's called a nationally determined contribution. And that sets out what each country will do to cut emissions and adapt to climate impacts. Now, the NDC, New Zealand's NDC, is different to emissions budgets because emissions budgets are focused entirely on what we do at home. So it is about our actions to reduce domestic emissions, whereas the NDC is broader than that. It includes also what we might do offshore to help other countries reduce emissions. So in that sense, the budgets will help contribute towards our broader NDC, but that doesn't get us all the way there. We do actually highlight in the report that if the first and second emissions budgets are not met, then of course we will actually need to do more offshore, so what's called offshore mitigation, to allow us to meet the country's first NDC, which covers this decade.
Thanks very much, Joe. So that's a really helpful clarification. So not a direct relationship between the Paris Agreement and what it is that New Zealand signs up to and commits there to what we have as emission budgets domestically. I wonder, just building from that then, does the Commission have a role in terms of providing any scorecard against New Zealand's international commitments under the Paris Agreement?
So our work is all focused on the domestic transition. Of course, the purpose in our Act is relates to the Paris Agreement and making contributions to achieving that. And that is done through the work we do to advise on those emissions budgets and the emissions reduction plan. From time to time, we've been asked to provide additional advice in relation to the country's NDC, and we'll be doing that again this year, providing advice to the government to go into their process for determining the next NDC starting in 2031, I believe. So in that piece of advice that we're going to be giving at the end of the year, we'll be basically providing information around what can be achieved domestically.
Oh, yeah, and I do think just to supplement Joe's comment, of course, our NDC for this decade has already been set, determined, published and locked in. My recollection, it's in the order of a net greenhouse gas emissions calculated using international standards of GWP 100, consistent with our national inventory accounting and methods used at the time it was set, so you can't just discover new sinks. That 571 million tonnes will change a little bit as methodologies and measurement techniques are adjusted, but by not much. And we now know roughly what the sequestration from established forest is going to be this decade. You're not going to plant a tree today that's going to absorb much carbon before 2030. We have some uncertainty about deforestation rates, the rate at which particularly plantation forests are cut down. But it's pretty clear now that we're about 100 million tonnes short this decade. And every tonne of domestic action that we do will save us having to meet part of our NDC through some sort of offshore mitigation or collaboration. So we are beginning to actually see the future, and the future is not that far away. And the challenge for New Zealand, people say, why would you bother meeting your NDC? And the answer is, well, first of all, a large number of countries are going to meet their NDCs. Secondly, you don't want to be the pariah wealthy nation that doesn't meet its NDC if others are. Thirdly, we've now signed trade agreements in the UK and Europe that make meeting your Paris commitments part of your right to access those affluent markets. And it's not just a matter of accessing it for certain products, it's accessing it for all products. The Europeans have made that clear. And if I recall correctly, I believe the Europeans have recently said, and if you're a country that's going to fall short through domestic action to meet your NDC, we will allow you to buy units in the European emission trading scheme to meet your obligations. And those units, I can promise you, are not going to be cheap.
Thanks, Rod. Thanks for that addition. And good to have that wider context. I'm going to ask a question. I think it's probably for you, Joe. It's a question from Jess. Thank you, Jess, for the question. And it's around the assessment of emissions from buildings. And the question from Jess is, the assessment of emissions from buildings is focused on operational emissions, and it doesn't look at embodied emissions. And she's just wondering, what is the rationale for that? Why are embodied emissions, or the emissions that were created in the production and the building of the buildings, if you like, are not included in the analysis, and simply it was the operational ones?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Yeah, so first I'll say that actually embodied emissions are really important. So because they provide a fuller picture of the emissions associated with your activity. Having said that, the data available to calculate embodied emissions is much less reliable. It's much more complicated to build up that picture. And so in our we've given advice in the past to support Statistics New Zealand, who are currently doing work in this area, to work on the robustness of that data set. So we report, our monitoring report focuses on those operational emissions, largely because of that reliance on that those official statistics for that robustness. But again, highlighting it is important to have that bigger picture, and we need to work on that data as a country.
Thanks, Joe. And thanks for acknowledging the importance of all of those emissions as we tackle climate change. I want to turn quickly, maybe back to you again, Joe. What are the consequences for the government if it does not meet the emissions budgets that have been set?
Thanks, Stuart. So if a budget is not met, then a court declaration could be sought. And when this declaration is made, following all the appeals, etc., the minister must then table that declaration to the Parliament, along with advice on the government's response to that declaration. So essentially, there's a mechanism here that in practice means that it will be for the people of New Zealand to hold the government to account for not meeting its legal obligations. And part of what we do, our independent advice, is to get ahead of actually missing budgets and provide transparency on how we're tracking and where we can make change so that we actually don't get to that outcome. Because, of course, ideally, the system puts us on track and keeps us on track to hitting our targets.
And of course, we are up against a rock, because if the government doesn't meet its domestic emissions budget this decade, it doesn't change our obligations under the nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. So essentially, it's deciding that we can't do enough domestically, we'll pay somebody else our wealth for them to have done more. And as a consequence, you roll into the 2030s with a dirtier production system than you would have had you made the investments earlier to reduce your emissions in line with budgets. We have been clear that the emissions budgets that have been set are both technically achievable and economically affordable. So if we miss them, it's because we have chosen to pollute more at home and pay someone who pollutes less abroad.
Thanks very much, Rod, for that additional context, and thanks both of you for drawing out the additional elements of these questions. I'd like to turn now to a question. Thank you, Kristen, for sending one in, and keep the questions coming, everybody. This is a really rich set that we're getting through. How often will the Commission publish this kind of report, and where can we download it, please? And could you please, alongside that relatively simple question on the process side, could you please share the reasons why emissions have reduced in recent years? And is that because of COVID? So was it a one-off reason for it, or what were the reasons for those reductions in emissions in recent years?
Sure, thanks, Stuart. So our emissions reduction monitoring reports are going to be produced annually. So we'll publish every year from now. And it's can be downloaded from our website. So I think probably the easiest thing is if someone pops a link in the chat right now, and then you can go directly to it. Coming to the more substantive question, I can say that COVID did have an impact on emissions over recent years, particularly in the transport sector. Emissions have reduced through a combination of policy efforts and actions from New Zealanders, as well as external events. And emissions in 2022 were overall 7.3% lower than 2019. And provisional data indicates a further fall of about 1% in 2023. Now, we did some work in the report that to highlight that around 94% of the emissions reductions between 2021 and 2022 were strongly linked to external factors. The main example was a big reduction in electricity emissions, as we had a lot of rainfall going into our hydro lakes, and that basically allowed our hydropower to push out coal and gas generation. But this only provides for a temporary drop in emissions. That's not something that we can rely on every year, having plentiful rainfall. And so that speaks to the need of needing to install more increasing amount of renewable generation, as well as storage.
Thanks very much, Joe. Anything, Rod, to add into that? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question.
No, it was a good answer, Joe. Thanks.
Thanks very much. A question from Jessica, and we're speaking into the energy sector here. Now that we have more certainty on the future of Tiwai and the smelter, what does that mean for our future renewable energy needs? And do we have enough projects in the pipeline? I'm imagining that some renewable energy generation projects in the pipeline to meet the demand.
Yeah. So having certainty about Tiwai is an important thing because it's such a big electricity load. You know, it's so significant in our system. And so Tiwai having announced that it is staying should help generators feel more confident and have more certainty about investment. And so the logic from there is you would expect that this will lead to more renewable generation being built because of that increased certainty. The information we have available currently shows that renewable generation build appears to be on track. The current level of renewable generation build is consistent with what the Commission modelled in its demonstration path and with the Electricity Authority's survey data on what is needed. And of course, building more renewable electricity generation is going to be critical for electrification for meeting our emissions targets. And at the same time, it's also critical. It's not just about building more generation. We also need to have the infrastructure to support a more electrified economy. And that means having the electricity lines, networks fit for purpose, having sufficient storage, and really also something that's often not talked about, but also very important, is around the electricity efficiency and the ability for people to manage their demand. All of these things are going to be and are increasingly important to keep on top of.
Thanks very much, Jo. We've had a question in from one of the participants around the NDC, and thank you, Rod. I think you've spoken a little bit about that, and Jo, you also have talked into that. And I think it's around compliance with our NDC under Paris. So what would happen if New Zealand wasn't able or didn't comply with our nationally determined contribution? What are the implications for us of that? Maybe it's a question. Jo, do you want to have a go at that first, and then Rod, or feel free to speak in either of you.
Yeah, sure. Well, so first of all, we haven't heard any confirmation of this. So I want to make that clear. But you are right that as time goes on, meeting the NDC is getting increasingly more difficult and expensive because of delay. And not meeting the NDC is hard to say exactly how that would pan out for New Zealand, but we would certainly expect to see greater scrutiny of our actions from our trading partners, particularly where we have free trade agreements, and particularly with those strong climate elements within them, like the EU FTA. You know, not meeting the NDC is also likely to come with a loss of influence on the global scene in relation to climate change, which may mean we are in a less of a position to actually advocate for a response that takes into account our national circumstances. And then I think the final thing is that global consumers and customers are increasingly scrutinising their supply chains and looking for products that are reducing emissions. And so we do increase risks around loss of the global markets in that respect as well. Rod, did you want to add?
Yeah, I think I'd like to build on one of your points, Jo, which is when the rest of the world looks at New Zealand, if we haven't met our nationally determined contribution, and we won't know on the 31st of December 2030 whether we have, so it takes a couple of years for inventories and count up to happen. But when the partners that we care about look at our behaviour and go, did you do all that you said you would, and did you do all the things you could have done, that's going to inform whether it's that you tried hard but missed, or you didn't try and could have. And so foreign countries who are incurring very real economic costs to reduce their emissions today, and that includes the Europeans, it includes the British. Increasingly, it actually includes the Americans. I mean, their way of incurring costs is through public subsidies. But, there's $500 billion of taxpayers' money being made available to reduce emissions in America. So the idea they're not doing anything is just wrong. So when those countries then look at New Zealand in the early 2030s and they look at our 2020s decade and they go, well, you could have made a better effort to, for example, decarbonize ground transport. There were known technologies, they were available, but you just chose to buy cheap, high-polluting cars. You could have chosen to stop burning as much coal and fossil gas to make electricity by investing more sooner in renewables, but you chose not to. I think that's going to influence what the world thinks about New Zealand's behaviour more than whether we did or didn't hit, the exact number of tonnes for this decade. And if the rest of the world looks at New Zealand and says, you didn't try, you didn't take up the known technologies, you were short-sighted, selfish, and reckless in your use of the climate for profit, I think their attitudes to us will be very different than if we'd tried hard and done all we could, but things didn't turn out well.
Thanks, Rod. And this has been a great example of how everything in this system is joined together. We've had a great conversation of individual sectors about the New Zealand economy and domestic action, and also linking that into the international sphere. So thank you very much, both of you. We've probably got time for a couple more questions. I'm going to send one, I think, your way, possibly Joe, and it's around, it's a question from Peter. And the question is, the government has said it has a least cost approach to responding to climate change, and that any measures taken can't impact on business costs and profit. And Peter goes on to say, obviously, the least cost approach is to carry on with things as they are and to carry on polluting. And how is that going to help us achieve our emissions targets?
So I'll jump in first and then throw to Joe. The first thing is that you should always ask the question when somebody says least cost, to say least cost to who, right? Is it least cost to me now? Is it least cost to you now? Is it least cost to you but later? And I think the short-term least cost of monetary values is actually a very small fraction of what a society values. So it actually turns out that reducing emissions now has co-benefits for lower household energy budgets as soon as we can, and better health outcomes for all of us sooner than later. So the least cost approach that only counts that part of the economy that is monetized and puts a dollar value on today that is orders of magnitude higher than the dollar value in 20 or 30 years' time, is to use a particular framework to answer the question, least cost to who and least cost when. And I think when it comes to the climate change, given the lags in policy responses can be 3 to 5 years, it is extremely short-sighted to think about it in terms of the 18-month business model of discounting cash flows and thinking only of the cash costs now. I think New Zealand will pay a very high price for a very narrow, short-sighted definition of cost.
Thanks
Just
very much.
I might just add into that, just thinking about it from the perspective of, homes and businesses, there are actually many opportunities to reduce gross emissions. So that's the emissions that, we release to the atmosphere, that actually save money over the long run. So they require some investment, but then that investment pays off. with lower operating costs. So two key examples of this are electric vehicles and heat pumps. So while electric vehicles are more expensive currently to purchase, you gain from the lower fuel costs over time because electricity is much cheaper. And that's similar with heat pumps. The cost of running a heat pump of electricity is much lower than any other form of heating. And just to reiterate what Rod said, there are many wider benefits to actions that when you incorporate those, also really turn the dial on what is least cost. And that's such as cleaner air and health improvements. And so those are some of the things that we factored in to our previous advice on options for their second emissions reduction plan, trying to make sure that the options taken are capturing those additional benefits that save money and make people healthier in other parts of society.
I'd also make two other observations. One is that least cost may also be higher risk, and the Commission has called out the uncertainty associated with, for example, offsets in the biosphere to compensate for permanent emissions from the geosphere. In other words, burning coal is not equal to sequestering carbon from the atmosphere in trees. This is a false equivalency. So uncertainty may be higher in the pursuit of this least cost option. And I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind. It's what is going to work over time, and how certain are we that the decisions made today will lead to permanent and additional reductions in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So I think that uncertainty thing is really, really important, as well as that question of benefits that are not captured in a narrowly defined least cost framework.
Thanks very much, Rod. We're drawing the webinar to a close. It's been a fabulous time with you all. I would like to give Rod and Joe perhaps 30 seconds each for any kind of closing out key messages you want our participants today to take home with them. Rod, perhaps beginning with you.
Yeah, when Parliament, 119 members, all those present on the day, voted for the Climate Change Response Act amendments that brought into life the budgets, the targets, the independent commission, 119 members unanimously agreed that any government in the future would be better off with an independent, expert-based, evidence-informed advisory group. When they did that, they also set out what criteria should be taken into account by first the Commission in giving its advice, and then by the government, because ultimately it is the government of the day that sets the budgets and plans, in considering budgets and plans. Cost was one of those things, but Parliament was very, very clear that it was not the only driver for what should be an emissions budget and a plan to achieve that budget. Parliament was very clear. It was also interested in the impacts which affect communities and households and businesses. It was interested in making sure that the advice and its decisions took into account how iwi Māori might be impacted because of their circumstances. It was also the case that the government, in setting the criteria, wanted to be clear that technology could play a part in our assessment, but wishful thinking about future technologies alone wasn't enough to drive a budget or a plan. So the government, in setting its final emissions plan, does need to write a legal plan.
Thank you very much, Rod. Joe, some closing comments, summary from you.
Yeah, just really quickly to recap what our monitoring report has found. Emissions have been coming down. We are seeing New Zealanders acting, and the action beginning to make a difference to our end emissions. When we look forward, we see significant risks and an urgent need to put in place policies to address those risks. But there are plenty of opportunities to go further and do that faster. Ultimately, it's actually this is designed so it's the government's choice on how to do that, and it is our role as an independent agency to monitor that progress and make it clear to the public of New Zealand. And that's it from me.
Thanks very much for that closing summary, and really important to join us back in again about the role of the Commission and the role of the public and all of us here in Aotearoa New Zealand and the role that we all have to play. I want to thank all of the participants who have joined us online today for their time, and a special thanks to you, Rod, and to you, Joe, for sharing your insights and taking those questions and your answers on those today.